So I did my industry shadow with John Blackburn. He's the principal architect of Blackburn Architects out in Washington, D.C. We had a very long, very interesting conversation, so I'll try to keep it short and sweet. But basically, he was from Eastern Tennessee. And so starting out, his intro to horses, his intro was through his sister. His sister rode horses when they were younger. He never really had an interest in riding, but he did ride bareback every now and then. But that's about as far as his interest went. And then in his intro to architecture was in high school. So he took a mechanical drawing class, which he ended up really liking, and his teacher said he was really good at. So with that, he didn't like math, but he liked working with his hands. So he kind of looked into doing architecture school from high school. So he applied to 3 different schools. He applied to Clemson, Georgia Tech, and NC State. He got waitlisted for Clemson, and then he did make it in finally. And then he did a 5-year degree program there. So in architecture, in order to get licensed, you have to either, at least now anyway, and every state's different, but in South Carolina, you have to have a 5-year accredited degree, or you have to have a 4-year and then a 2-year accredited master's. So he did the 5-year accredited degree, which would allow you to get a license. And then for grad school, he went to Washington University in St. Louis, where he got a degree in urban design. So it's something he really liked going into architecture. He thought he liked repurposing buildings. But after doing his urban design master's, he realized he didn't like planning. He liked things to be active and to be happening instead of waiting for things to happen as far as things being built. So after school, he moved to DC, part of which was because one, his girlfriend, but also because his interest in history, and he felt like he was going to end up working on older buildings. Not quite what happened, but so once he got there, he realized that it didn't really happen the way he thought he was going to. So he teamed up with a friend of his in landscape architecture, and so they hadn't even really formed anything official yet. But they actually ended up getting a job and landed a job out of Middleburg, Virginia. So this owner had horses at a track, but he wanted a barn, I guess. And so the reason they got the job, though, was so his friend, landscape architect, was from Middleburg, Virginia. And they ended up, in architecture, you usually study the site when you're doing a project. So they ended up studying Middleburg, I guess, and doing things to relate the project back to Middleburg. So this is like the forms you would need to kind of fit in. You need the materials you need to fit in. And the owner hired them immediately. So they ended up designing 7 buildings and a farm. So that kind of just like was the beginning of branching into what he ended up doing for however many years. So his focus is on healthy stables. That means designing with light and ventilation in mind, air in mind, so natural lighting, natural ventilation, natural heating and cooling. So what he said, his quote from him was, "The foal is worth more than the barn, so protect the foal at all costs." So one of the projects they worked on, Herringwood Farm, is an example of how they use Bernoulli's principle, and so that's basically the reason why airplane wings are designed the way they are. So the air kind of goes around it. So the warm air and the cool air separate. So we know that hot air rises, cold air sinks. So that kind of thing. And then things kind of calmed down, died down a little bit after that. His partner went on to do some other stuff. So they kind of cycled through partners based on recession and stuff like that. But he stayed consistent through it. And his firm was at the time, so they started the firm in 1983. And at the time, it was Smith and Blackburn. Smith was the landscape architect he worked with. But then about 1993, it ended up being just him, so it was just Blackburn. And so going with that, he had a little bit more downtime, I think. And so he went into, I think, Horse Magazine, I think is what it was. He brought to them the idea of an article he wanted to write on light and air when it comes to barn design, because he was saying a lot of times back then, people would just have a metal building to throw horses in or whatever it was, and they weren't really designing barns for a farm. And so from there, technology started advancing. So he got introduced to the internet and everything, and started creating a website to kind of expand their impact. And so after all that, he's been in this business for about 40 years. They designed about 300 farms, 300 barns, and currently he has about 11 people working underneath him. And he's actually going to be retiring soon. He's about done with it. So when they first started out with the business, they were only designing 2 to 3 farms a year, and they do residential barns as well as adaptive reuse. But now they're doing about 15 to 20 projects at a time, and it ranges from multiple different states as well as different countries, which I think is really cool. Because I mean, every state has different codes and have different regulations, and I'm sure different countries do as well. Now, as far as how this relates to the equine industry and equine professionals, obviously this is an architectural position, but it specializes. The project specializes in equine facilities. So obviously he's going to have almost a direct impact on the equine industry because, I mean, where do we keep horses? We keep them in barns and on land. So, I mean, the design of that is very crucial to how we keep horses. And we did facility design in our studies here in this class. And then obviously though, as architects, we do a lot of research and you have to talk to people, talk to clients, talk to experts. And so he does that as well. He's talked to vendors. One thing he's learned over the years is for arenas, as we've learned, are a little complicated when it comes to the footing. So he will design where the arena goes, but if the clients have a question about the footing, he just directs them to the experts because it's very complicated and it's very dependent on the horse that you have. So that he's learned where the boundaries are between what he's licensed to do and what his profession, and then what's beyond that, but also giving references for the clients to someone to talk to. So his job has a pretty direct impact, I think, on the equine industry. It's not super involved, I guess, in things, but I mean, it's kind of his job encompasses the start. This is where horses start, is where they're housed and where they're kept. Now, the only thing, he's very complimentary and very of this profession, and he loves it. And I asked him if there was an industry in this, because obviously it's having income and having business is important. And he said at the time when he started, there definitely was, and there still is, across the country. At the time, there's only 5 firms he knew of that were doing these kinds of projects. So there's still a need for it, I think, for designing barns, because not many people could do that. And so he loves what he does. But I asked him about cons. And so the one thing he said is the way he designs the healthy stables is expensive. Designing sustainably is expensive no matter what you do, because you're using methods usually that aren't normal to construction. So you have to be innovative and you have to use things that aren't normally used. And so if you do sustainability in the sense of solar panels, obviously solar panels cost a lot. Designing for natural ventilation is not always the most basic design ever. It can be, but usually not. So his one con was not, a lot of people can't afford it sometimes. It's what's necessary sometimes. It's better for the health of the horses, but it comes at a cost, and not everyone can afford it. But overall, I think that I was very intrigued by this shadow. It definitely opened my eyes to maybe another possibility of what I could do one day. And as far as careers in the field, I mean, it's just an architect position, or you could work underneath an architect as well in a firm that does equine facilities, as a designer, as a schematic drawer. But overall, I think it would be interesting to look into, potentially for a future career.